society, as well as leading to the cumulative identification of society. The two are combined. If we can get to the fundamental nature of work, the work which is enjoyable by those who produce it, then there is some kind of key in Leo's attitude, which is to do with defining the fundamentals on which society can be united, on which things can be whole. To say that that, for the moment, takes the general appearance of a neoclassical style would be to simplify it. That is perhaps how it appears for the moment. Who cares? But it's that fundamental unification of the individual's enjoyment in his work and the agreement, the concord of the individual and society to create work and to create the social framework for that work to be legitimate in, on which Leo seems to base his point. Maurice seems to base his point on the necessity for revolution. In order for that revolution to take place, all kinds of expediency may be required. In the realm of architecture, it may be necessary to use, and I say use in the English sense, but also in the French sense, to use up whatever capital architecture has in order to enable people to identify with the actual process of the revolution and bring their strength to it and accede to it and accept it so that it will come about. Yes? Bernard seems to be taking a more philosophical position, standing back from society and seeing that people do not necessarily identify with work individually or socially unless there is some set of conventions which enables them to know that what they experience socially is also a good personal experience, and that what they experience personally is also a good social experience. The analogy of language is the analogy of a system in which the individual accepts the system in order to communicate with the others. The language is necessary for the individual and for the others. He seems to call for a definition of a language of architecture, perhaps of our time, in which this reconciliation would take place. Now, none of them have stopped me, so this enables you to see that there is a position here in which I can fade out, because Leon's rather naive hope that there could be a personal resolution of work into society, and Maurice's...
Well, could I...
Okay.
I don't think... No, I mean, he is really a problem, because I suppose that always when I discuss this, there's a necessity of social change, and in the end of socialism. And it's really the problem of socialism. It's only the way this comes about. And I think the problem is to see any instrumentality in any kind of style to come towards the liberation of mankind, which is, after all, the problem of revolution and of looking forward into the future. Now, I think that's really what was so very strange about socialism so far, and about capitalism. What was so incredibly similar was that, in a way, work was something which was not important, which one didn't talk about. That was part of life, you know. That's a given thing. You work 8 hours a day, you work 15 hours a day, you don't discuss that. That's part of the biological cycle of life. And over that, really, life was, in a way, lost. And also the argument in the 19th century was that, you know, industrialization is, in a way, necessary to get rid of this necessary work, which, after all, humanity is thrown with to liberate itself from the condition of nature and so on. Now, I suppose that really this work, which is, after all, to liberate yourself, or in a way to free yourself from the condition of nature, is essential in the way, after all, is life in the end. And it's, in the end, pleasure. If you throw away that, and if you interject something which would pertain towards or which strives towards a state of complete freedom, I think you lose, in the end, the goal itself. Because if you work towards freedom, complete freedom, what do you do with freedom? You know, you're just open to consumption and...
Yes, but who are you to say that? You are Robert Krier, well published in Japanese, French, English magazines. But you are only Robert Krier. and this is the dead end. True. It's not true. Exactly. You are Leo Krier. You cheat your brother. So the point is that you could say that to the audience here, and this has no revolutionary meaning to use your term revolutionary, because you are only you. It's all I could say, and we use you. You know that we use the scheme and the drawing of Leon Krier. We use your drawing because we put a curve in the mud until this bone stick out. But you put you on the golden plate, and we go with your drawing to our municipalities. You say, this is Leon Krier. Look, it's published in Japan, Germany, France, and so on. And he is for street and place. This is the man we want. We don't want you. We want your ID. So you are the counterposition to Corbusier, because you are well published, and it's important to be published for you and published everywhere in the world because we use you. So in a way, you say you are also a comrade of us, even if you don't take a car because it's too expensive for you. It was what I tried to say. You speak in front of audience of many architects or students, it seems. My audience is not that audience. I have no audience. I am at the service of my party. Is it a party? Is it a party?
Yes.
Of my party, and it's all. And we have no hope for architects outside of this of way of acting. That I believe it firmly.
So Leon is protesting against consumerism, but Maurice is prepared to consume Leo. That's the problem. Bernard.
I would like just to make a very general point. We've been using the word language, and much of that whole event is about the idea of language as a map. And I think it's very necessary quickly to say that that's a very dangerous analogy to use. In a sense, architecture, if architecture was a language, it would be a very bad one at that. You know, language is meant to communicate, and certainly architecture is not the best means of communication that I know, certainly. So in this respect, I think we're using, you know, an analogy which is at the same time an inevitable one, because I think one of the difficulties of the conversation, which is one difficulty that architecture always has, is that it's very difficult to grasp, it's very difficult to hold it, because somehow it's being, yes, conditioned by some of the things that we've been talking about, you know, a particular social, cultural context, or economic context. But at the same time, there are certain things that have to do with, and I think all of us will agree on that, with the experience of a city, the nature of a city, whether it be expressed through certain densities, certain sort of activities, or be it expressed through a series of spaces that can be identifiable, drawn on a drawing board, be it Renaissance, Baroque, neoclassical spaces, or whatever. But basically, they're part of a spiritual experience. And somehow, that socio-economic aspect of architecture, or even, let's say, the conceptual aspect of architecture, is not necessarily, let's say, reducible, or, let's say, possible to it's not possible to bring it down to that particular experience of the city. And I think that we have to use those analogies, or those metaphors. And I would say that the metaphor of language, in a sense, is also hiding a few things. Because I'd love to, perhaps, to go back to something that I've been sort of interested in again and again. Is at the beginning of the 20th century, something happens in Vienna with the discovery of psychoanalysis. And there's that strange thing which takes place. Language is nothing but a sort of means, you know. It's the vehicle of the unconscious, the way that sort of pulls it through, right? And whether you call it the unconscious of one person, or the one of the so-called collective unconscious, which relates us, again, to our overall discussion, is one thing that is quite important. In a sense, what we're not interested in, or what I would say language means, is not really language, but what's in between. You know, there's certain things you can express. And that's why the discussion on style and on form seems to be a bit dangerous, because it implies that there are certain things that you can identify and you can give name to them. And like, yes, crescent, colonnade, arcades. But I really believe that perhaps the thing happens between the place where you find, the name for it. Just like in a dream, which reconciles things which are not reconcilable in real life. And somehow, much of the talk about form or about language is already an oversimplification which is inevitable, I would say, because of the difficulty of defining what architecture is, because of its paradox and its contradiction. But this is perhaps just a little point that I wanted to make, just in
Right.
Could I ask
Somebody.
a question of Maurice, please?
Yes.
If, from what you've been saying to us tonight, I feel I could equally well make myself an equal with you by saying that I was a member of the National Front in England, which is the fascist party. I could then say that I dedicate everything I do to the cause, and I justify all my activities through it. I could then say that I throw mud at everybody because of the cause. Then I would be equal with what you've been telling us tonight, giving us tonight, and we would be equal people. I could then start expanding an ideology or the ideals which is going to be achieved through that mudslinging, and I would then sort of take a step which you haven't gone anywhere near taking tonight. Could you perhaps, can we set up a hypothesis whereby you're still alive and you succeeded? What then would your role as an architect and your operative techniques or whatever be?
I think you are right. If a lot of architects were more conscious of the people they are serving, they will probably enroll in the fascist party. So it will be better for everybody, because now...
No, you're avoiding the issue because
No,
you're still playing the same game then.
not at all. It's simply the architectural act is never a neutral act. When you build this house in the country, it's all right. It's okay. You could do the mistake. I suppose you do something else. But if you do only small houses, or just it's a small job, expertise, so it's all right. You are not very dangerous for the society. Let's say. But when you start destroying the city, to say I destroy the city because it's clear that the city will be destroyed because the car must run and the old building replaced by new building, because this is progress. When the architect says that, and they say that because all the project of promoter, the label is made by the architect. The text, the article for the project, it is typed by the article, and it's saying you must admit it. When the architect do this kind of job, they must rally, they must take the car number to the right wing, fascist or no fascist, I don't care, but they are not people of the left. This must be clear. So, for me, the problem is quite simple to answer to your question.
But Maurice, you seem to be saying that meanings are clear because of the confrontation. The confrontation, the conditions of society in which there is a war are such that everything is tainted with the conditions of society, and there is only one set of clear actions for you in dealing with that. Meanings are clear. But the question was precisely beyond that. Suppose that your revolution has been successful. I don't know whether this means successful in Belgium or successful in the world, but just suppose that it has happened. What would then be your attitude towards architecture? How would you then set about generating agreement amongst the communes who are now owning the city, what they should do to build where there has been destruction? How would you then generate an architecture for the good life after the revolution?
Yes, this is no problem.
That's her question.
Yes, but
No.
first thing, your question, if you pose me the question, in the reality of Belgium, I would say you this question is not a good question, because the reality of Belgium is a small neo-capitalist country under the banner of the flag of the state.
Yes,
This
so
is the situation.
let's go to
But
the world.
let's say admit that we were in France, by example, and in a lot of borough or city in France, the communists will be at the power in a few months, probably. They are in the head of this communists, these cities now. And then the thing is really different, if you have the power or not. If I was in the Soviet Union, by example, I will be probably with the power, not with the contestataire, as I am now in Belgium, by example. And if you are with the power, let's say the socialist power, you have a lot of things, as an architect, by example, to explain to political people. You must say that is very dangerous to I speak for the city because it's quite tricky if you got outside of the city and it's too long. But let's say speaking about the city, I would say it's better to have a small operation of rehabilitation. Because if you do very large operation, very often the money will run out in the middle and you have to stop, and then a lot of people will be thrown away for a long time, even the socialist society, because money is money in any kind of society. So I will say do small operation of rehabilitation, because then the people could switch from one houses and after that to other houses. And I would say the program of the French city, by example, try to promote the street, by example, and the place. Not because I love street or place, not at all, because we believe that the street or the place is the adequate answer to a question, to do a city that is the best way to, let's say, if you put building like that block and you give an answer to the location of people problems, they have an apartment, well, it's fine if you do this. But what happens also that the green that you have put around the building will be destroyed by the children because they don't care, because, well, they don't feel to have the care of their environment. So if you have some kind of street and a classical pattern, the public space is smaller. You have just sidewalk. It's quite easy to have to do it and to look at the sidewalk. And inside the block you have garden, and the mother could look in the inside of the block and so on. So when we ask for street and for place, it's because we have since 68 we have a battle in Brussels, and when we start this battle, the position we have at that time, 68, were different than the one we have today, because today we are really sure that what we want, because we could have the experience of it. So we have a program for a socialist city. We do not have a model for the image of the socialist city. For me, this image is not the one of Krier for La Villette, but is the one of, it's the same image, in fact, as the one of the city of today, except that the chaos will be not the one of the capitalists that are building the tower and the highway, but the chaos resulting of the mistake that we have done together. So we do mistake and we will correct them, but we have not a definite image of the city. That was a big mistake of the Russian architect in the year 25, and we must avoid to repeat this mistake. So I suppose my answer is clear.
Can I come in on this point? And relating it back to the cynical use.
Can you speak up, please, so that people...
Relating it back to the cynical use of language, of architectural imagery. I think it's a very cynical approach anyway. Now, what I'd like to say is that if one looks at it in the light of what you would like to achieve in political terms, without going into the details of that it beats me really how you can say that by using or by exploiting the same human or physical backdrops that humanity has been confronted with over the last few hundred years, the backdrops which we've seen, to which people relate a certain number of mistakes and achievements. By backdrops, I mean the physical appearance of things and the close association between them and behaviors. A simple example. Do you really conceive of a so-called really progressive and revolutionary behavior within a room which would be furnished with a couple of Rococo chairs and a Rococo sofa? If you are to use these at their own function and not as a so-called revolutionary function. Okay? Now what I'm saying is that the backdrops to which humanity has been confronted in architectural terms carry with them all sorts of associations in people's minds, which you seem to have a certain respect for. Now, how do you expect people to adopt in the long run a socialist and revolutionary attitude if you are feeding them with the same backdrops?
Look at you, you wear the ties. Your ties, not mine, could be made in 1892. How about that? Your suit, it was the same 50 years ago. Your hair, you kept the same way. So, to answer to your question, if you pose it to me, put a feather on your head, a pea in your ear, what do you call that? A ring in your... So maybe you look a little bit more modern, because your question is so old-fashioned.
That's rubbish.
No, it's not rubbish. Your question is rubbish. Yes, it's rubbish. You speak about Rococo seat for what is this meaning? I never say we have to use Rococo seat.
It's meaning that you are dealing with elements that people relate to. Okay? Now, you may look upon them, and I may look upon them with a certain disdain. But what I'm saying is that in the eyes of the people who are going to use them, that disdain does not exist. Okay? Now, if that disdain does not exist, they relate to them in a completely different way than you and I do. That's what I'm really aiming at. And if they are relating to them in a different way than you and I do, how the hell do you expect them, in the long run, to be able to achieve that mental capacity which can bring, little by little, to those social changes? It's got nothing to do with the color of your tie or all that stupidity.
Yes.
I mean, it's perfectly...
Of what Afshiman you speak, you could build, and we will build today any kind of house in any manner. You could build a classical house because the price is the same, and very often the quality of the construction is better. So you could say it. This question, I don't understand it really, because let's say when we say I prefer neoclassical style, well, this is some kind. I say that for the debate. Well, in fact, I prefer it, really. This is my own taste. But the taste, let's say, of my party, it's the range. It's not only neoclassical. They like neoclassical, not too much. They prefer mainly, let's say, this kind of style, this kind of house, small windows, and let's say the English style that you could see in the street. So they prefer, it's not my prefer, it's what they prefer. And we will give to them. This is only the facade, and I never will make a battle for a facade. So the facade could be modern or not modern, because this problem with the facade is no important. If you like Rococo chair, buy them, but they are very expensive. We have plastic ones that are cheaper, and you could buy this one, but they are also expensive. So I really don't understand. This is an old question that you take any books, and you have the conservative, let's say the progressists in the 30s say the same thing you say today.
Now, because you're completely going the other way. The facade doesn't exist in your eyes and does not exist in my eyes. But in the eyes of the people which are outside this little room, that facade has very strong meanings. And you have to accept it. Okay? Now what I'm saying is that if you accept these meanings, which can be explained historically and socially, in terms of what they mean and in terms of what they relate to, now if you accept these meanings, then how on earth can you use them especially as certain meanings would be in the long run in complete dichotomy with what you are actually setting out to do.
But your problem is, seems to me, you're talking about settled meanings.
Of course, that's what he's talking
And,
about.
and one has to say that everything that evolved historically had a different meaning at the time it evolved from the meaning it has now. And that is probably one of the great justifications for consuming objects, because their meaning, in a sense, is, in any case, diminished and transformed by today. But are you asking that architects or designers should create a style which expresses the problem of today or the vision of the future, and that is what should be promulgated?
I wouldn't go as far as that, because I don't think that there could be such a style, if one wants to put it into form and words. I think that in the end, what we're talking about is mental attitudes to things and to life. And to crystallize these into shapes would be somehow ambiguous. So that wasn't really my point, as far as I'm concerned. My point was the cynical use of a certain type of language for, in his own words, the attainment of power. That's what I was basically driving at.
Not my power.
Well, you were talking about power for 5 minutes.
Not mine.
Can't respond to it, okay.
I think that what has to be worked out there is that if Maurice is shown cynicism in employing those meanings, it must be said that capitalism as a system has shown cynicism, and it's an answering cynicism, if you like, to be fair. Is there anybody else who feels strongly on this point? Otherwise we're in danger of getting into a corner. Is there anybody else who feels strongly about this point?
Could I just...
Sure.
I think, in a way, the problem of style is, for us, is incredibly important. But in a way, I don't think that is the problem at all, because it doesn't matter. I think the main issue is now the city. And, a fortnight ago, Maurice and I went to Louvain-la-Neuve, which is a new town outside Louvain, near Brussels. And it is a thing which was done basically through the idea of an archaeologist. And he tried to avoid all the architectural gimmickry. And he imposed on the architects to use brick and concrete, which I dislike strongly, but at least it was a very strong thing to do, to impose for a new town two materials. Another thing was that they had to use streets, which were rather narrow. And another thing was also very imaginative, was that they had to use hills, and it was not on flat ground. Now, if you go there, it's quite amazing, because it's, however you hate it stylistically, and I find it really awful. It's kitsch in a subtle way, because it doesn't want to be kitsch. But but on the other hand, it's an incredible achievement, because there are streets and squares. And what was, one could discuss it. At least you have some, and it's amazing the power they have, the social power they have. Now, what was so incredible for me was not the thing to see that, but to come back to Brussels and to really see how amazing Brussels is. Things which seem to be daily look suddenly incredibly extraordinary. And we came through a suburb, which was rather banal piazza, a place square, which was sort of changed and vulgarized through commercial and awful signs. But at least there was suddenly a subtlety. And I felt, if we begin to build streets and squares, we will rediscover what the city was before. We will rediscover the things which we are living in and the subtleties of them. Because we are now so impoverished, our vision is so impoverished, that or so primitive, of old and new, of progress and reaction, of this, doesn't matter. It's important, and I think it would be important, for instance, to show, perhaps to take an old street and to paint it all white, to see what it does because one is always used to see new buildings look bright and old buildings look awful. A similar thing was in the Centre Pompidou in Paris. They showed the îlots which were there before the Centre Pompidou were painted very carefully in old. They looked like 1,000 years old, although they were done in watercolor, and they looked terribly old and decrepit, and you really wanting to get rid of it. If you had painted these white, they would look like a project of Culot, where everybody would like it. and which would become collectively acceptable. So I think it's a very slow process, and we don't, or I don't at least, want to propose this villette, as something which is to be built like that precisely every corner right. Because I don't think one can say, although I have my own taste in architecture, and I know exactly what I want to build. But I think there's an issue which is more important, is to propose a system which is, in a way, general enough to allow for this distinction of public and private, and to allow also something which is architecture and something more simple, so that not everything claims to be of the same value and of the same intensity. And I don't think we can say at this moment this is the right thing. I think it's something which has to do with the way of production. And perhaps people are so incredibly creative that popular culture will, in the end, will be Baroque. I don't know, in 2,000 years. I don't care, although I don't mind Baroque, But I don't think that's our problem now. And I think even popular culture could be Baroque if it comes to such an incredible sophistication and intelligence, awareness. And I'm not against Rococo at all, because it was very pleasurable and it was very conscious of itself and enjoyed any moment of life. Only at that moment it was a privilege of a few. I don't think you can give it now to people as, and I think there is profound cynicism to say that we give to people a style. I think that is the, where you break. I don't think you can.
No, well, I want to make 2 or 3 remarks about the discussion. The first is that I find especially interesting that people begin to be concerned with style just in the moment when style disappears, when there is no more style. So
that's
international.
Not true. It's not true.
When style disappears, I mean there are no official style, at least between architects. There are other styles, trying to become official style. And on the other hand, if you accept this principle, the question will be, maybe architect cannot live and act and teach and design without this certitude of style. And a third question would be, who is creating the style? Which are the methods? Which are the modes to create the style? Is it just a mechanical reaction from a mode of production, or it's part of a kind of cultural superstructure? So I think this could be, on this hand, the important point about the discussion, because what can be style in the story is naturally a kind of social agreement in one initial proposal, maybe by an architect. It's a kind, of cultural melting pot. Maybe today it's not possible to have this. And that is the chaos Maurice was speaking about. And so we are just living in, for the first time.
Can I ask you a question about this? I think what is the first big square that the king created in France? The Place Henri?
The Place de Vosges.
Yeah, Place de Vosges. In what sense was style an important element for the possibility of creating a new regular urban space, where before, in the medieval culture, there had been rather irregular urban spaces? In what sense was style necessary for that to happen? That's one question. The second question is, does this regular urban space, which is now in the Renaissance language consistent and self-reflecting, does it make a difference to the social reality of the time? Which came first? The style as an enabler of the space, or the space as a statement of social reality?
I think it's a dialectic problem,
But if it's it is a dialectic problem, then style is possibly quite an important element, in that it could allow a new social configuration to take place, the medieval city to be pushed apart, new contracts to be written for the social role of burgher, that is to say, somebody who is engaged in trade, allowed to become, to s'enrichisser, to make himself rich, but within that context, within the license of the king. It's a new step in social evolution. This style does seem to me to be extremely important for that to have happened and to be seen to have happened. Would you agree?
Yeah.
So this brings us to Lear, you see, who is searching for some kind of transcendental, archetypical, universal thing which collectively could be seen to be effective.
And I think one has to make one difference, that town planning has nothing to do with style. No. And that is one terrible problem.
Yeah, it's another discussion. I just took one part of this.
But it has to do
No,
with
but
style.
today, the style is really in the bourgeois category, and we can't avoid it. Even if you make modern, all that is style. Even Corbusier style, the factories are style. It has to do with the division of labor.
No, it's
That the guy who designs must have a cultural model in his mind to design a form at all. It does not come out of a process. And even Foster is style, however awful it is, but it's style. And it's the ultimate style in a way, because it's no style and it's every style, and it pretends not to be style, but it ought to be not moral, but in fact it's the ultimate morality.
It's a know-how. It's nothing more.
It's in the end the issue of the division of labor, which produce style. And I think it could be. And that is what is so different, and what always the bourgeoisie was so incredibly jealous, and what is really the basis of Bernard's article of pleasure, that the bourgeoisie always hated, could never deal with culture in a good way, because they were too busy in dealing with money and so on. So culture was always something which was only a facade, whereas the aristocracy was a very small class, which had such a well-organized, privileged system, that they completely enjoyed life. Any moment was perfect. Anything was meaningful. Anything they did was, even the way they sat on the loo, I think must have had some meaning. And it's really in such a small, sophisticated, very well-coded system, that style, as a cultural form, was able to retain a certain level and to evolve on very high level of consciousness. When that style, however, became the instrument to design anything in town, from the lamp to the car to everything, when it became universal, when it really began to destroy the traditional ways of production, which were those of craft, it had to become vulgar, and it had to become in the end meaningless, because it could never sustain that level of consciousness which was, after all, the base of aristocratic culture.
Leo, in city planning, I would say, as for us, communist, style is something. Style is a tool, and we use it not for the pleasure of using style, but with style we could convince, we could do a lot of things. So we use style, and we say, as we don't care of style as an aim, we will use it by the most simple way of using it, because we know the majority of us architects are so poor. This is the truth, because it's like that. So we say we will play the security card, and it's the best card to play, and this card is to copy, and copy. And we will copy the best and the most economical model. It's why I say neoclassical, because Rococo is today impossible to copy, it's too expensive. Or neo-Renaissance flamande and so on. So we have a range of styles that we could copy quite easily. And when they show the project they've done yesterday for La Rochelle, the first thing for myself, what I think, what depends of energy, all this project. In fact, dealing with style, with all you spend a lot of time making your drawing, etc. Simply, you could recopy the plan of La Rochelle just in front of the old city, and with better block, maybe with better housing. But this was so simple to do, and why to take such a lot of energy just for let's say for fun, because these problems are not very fundamental problems. So just copy the planning of a good city. In fact, you like it.
Why not?
No, but
Why not? You don't do it, and in the competition, no one architect has done it. No one.
No, but I think there is really a problem here of cynicism, that you know very well that you are an architect who likes to draw and likes to deal with books, and is a very privileged situation. I mean, we are, in a way, the last of the humanity who enjoy their work, because I like working, I like to do many other things, but every time I work, I like it, because I always try to arrange the things which I want to do. And in that sense, one is incredibly privileged.
You are
and so, by...
artist.
No, but listen, but by saying that you copy, you deny the pleasure of doing something.
Not at all, because the copy is so
No.
difficult. It's terrible to copy. You must try.
Maurice, you are trying to play the role of the intellectual, the man who tells us the truth.
No,
and
no.
Leo is playing the role of the artist, the man who creates the beauty, and that's difficult.
He is probably Randeville, and I would be muted.
No, horrible.
I'm very reluctant to pull the conversation away from, far be it from me to pull it away from conversation about style, but the week, this week is supposed to be about the relationship of language to architecture, and I'm fascinated by it because it bores me, and I'm fascinated by this evening's conversation because the whole discussion so far this week seems to be not about architecture as what it is, but what we call it. It's not the thing we're looking at or experiencing, it's what we call it that seems to matter. So it's not exactly the physicality of the architecture or the aesthetic content necessarily, or even, and one's being very English here, the circumstantial content, because always the English fall back on circumstance as justification for things done for first-rate moralistic reason. And so I'm fascinated by the notion of the building or the architectural proposal isn't what it is, but it's what we call it. And if you pose against that way of looking at architecture some quite hairy and quite old, almost out of fashion attitudes to architecture. For instance, you can have a functionalist attitude towards architecture, either saying, does it work, or do we pretend that it works? Or you can have an opportunistic argument about architecture, i.e. what's in it for me. Or you can have a moralist attitude to architecture, which is something like, is it right by the set of rules that we happen to espouse at this moment? Or you can have a sensualist attitude towards architecture, does it turn me on? Or you can have some kind of philosophical overview attitude to architecture, which is, does it more or less sustain the long-range cultural optimism? Now, of course, what is curious is that I suppose socialism could also be analysed or discussed in these same terms, because in a sense, to me, socialism is a quasi-moralist base position, which uses function as life or quasi-function. I mean, often the socialists will say, well, it's good for you and you will get this payoff. And surely the history of socialism in this century has been that it has been as opportunistic as any other position can be seen to be. So you could start to look at architecture in functionalist, opportunist, moralist, sensualist, philosophical terms, or you could look at socialism in functionalist, opportunist, moralist, sensualist, philosophical terms. To my mind, since I am after all a bourgeois pluralist with optimistic tendencies, I don't have the implosion that these three gentlemen, or at least two of them, seem to suffer. I feel that the problem of the socialist is the language he uses maybe, but in the final analysis it implodes, it forecloses the potential either of language as a piece of culture itself, or as architecture as a piece of culture itself, or as architecture as experience, or dare I mention that word because I'm not really a functionist, function. I think there's a central paradox here. It's been, for me, for many years, the central paradox of the so-called relationship between architecture and socialism. I think that what is now sort of Maverick's point here, which is the foreclosure of architecture, the lack of optimism of architecture, the scurrying into corners which we're experiencing is partly a historical cycle. We're in fact historically waiting for the next thing to happen, and let's face it, that's really what's going on. But secondarily, I think it is that we are still leaning on the crutch of the so-called correspondence between socialism and architecture. And I think it's rather like, Catholicism, if you like. It's like a society maybe the Belgian society, who knows, still leaning on the crutch of Catholicism. And so, in a sense, I would like to propose that these two are really the central long-range cultural problems. Once we've forgotten, even attempting to go through the ritualistic thing of associating architecture with socialism, once we've gone through the sort of parallel rituals, then maybe we can start to talk about language, albeit that I'm just as cynical about language. I mean, I think architecture is after all, a spatial, experiential, and organizational pursuit, business, whatever you like to call it. And language is sort of really footnotes. For me, language remains footnotes, but that's the same.
Yes, well, I mean, people are trying to write the book of language in architecture so that those things you mentioned would become the elements of the language. How space is divided and who uses what space becomes significant socially, and the language is at that level, as well at the level of what you feel like when you look at the facade. You know, language isn't just another issue. It is to do with how we understand the use of architecture in social terms.
My point, Bob, though, is that it is in danger of emerging as it were, a second discipline. Language architecture is in danger at this moment of pessimism and real, waiting for the next thing to happen. It is in that danger.
Well, evidently we're all in danger of the revolution. Or whatever.
The red on the bed.
David.
Two questions, really. One point and one question. One of which is, the point is really that it seems to me to be an English disease in some senses to say that because somebody has a political position, that they of necessity can use a politically oriented art. So that, following on from what people are saying, it doesn't seem to me that because somebody's a socialist, they necessarily produce socialist architecture. This seems to me to be so sort of unnecessary to say. It's rather disturbing you still have to say it. The second point, though, is really why is really a question to all three of the speakers, which is why is the city the centre of their thought? Why, and particularly I think to Maurice Culot, who, if I remember the Communist Manifesto right, there is a portion of that in which Marx and Engels discuss the possibility of the erosion of the difference between the town and the country. Now, it seems to me that if one is actually deriving one's typology from the town, one is not, in a sense, being very orthodox Marxist at any rate. And why, I mean, the question really is, why is the country to be ignored in the typologies? I can understand in Maurice Culot's position that the action, in the sense of the political action, the involvement of architects in any particular form of struggle, is actually probably in the city because that's where architects are concentrated. But let's not imagine that things which are worth fighting about don't actually occur in the countryside as well. What I can't understand is why Leo Krier uses, and even Bernard Tschumi, I think, by implication, accepts the city as absolutely the crucial problem when we have in London depopulation of the centre of the city, we have in most American cities the same phenomenon, and we have certain instances which clearly show that in some senses the city is corkscrewing itself to some degree, not out of existence, but certainly out of a point which is absolutely the typical case of the way people live. So that's my question.
I would like to answer the first part of your question, the one about a socialist position, does it imply a socialist architecture? I think here you're entirely right. Just as there is no socialist science or bourgeois science, I don't think there is a socialist architecture or fascist architecture or bourgeois architecture. There is an architecture in the bourgeois society, there is an architecture in the socialist society, there is an architecture in a capitalist society. But there is no such thing as, you all know the whole discussion about Terragni being called by some as a fascist but being reused by socialists in other corners. They're simply things which are happening within a particular type of society. But just as science is not something that belongs to a particular, let's say, political movement. Architecture doesn't either. That's simply on that side.
No, I think one must here distinguish very clearly between the American conception of the city and the European one. I mean, we are, after all, Europeans, and we kind of are very aware of that, And it is, and one has really to see what the history of the city meant. And I come back later to the Marxist problem there. Is that in Europe, the city was always a place of privilege. It was a place of the burgher, it was a place of the citizens, was the place of the rights, of the civic rights. And the countryside was always a place of the devoid, of the underprivileged, of the peasant, of the stupid, of the exploited. Now, if we now know that in a capitalist economy, the city was in the beginning something very necessary to draw all the people together for industrial production. It was in the same time, it was the most dangerous kind of system which would explode the bourgeois economy. Because if you know all the urban struggles which happened in the 19th century in very quick sequence, were about to really explode into a different kind of quality in superseding, in going on with the dynamic of the French Revolution, and that is, that the peasants and workers would really win, the struggle, or at least be strongly part of the political cake. Now, I think that in a way, in the Garden City, at that moment, was in the late 19th century, was a solution to this dense agglomeration, which was dense enough for industrial production, but also loose enough to destroy this public realm, which after all was the most dangerous challenge to capitalist economy and reality in a way. Now, in the United States, the city was always something which was only necessary for economic reasons. It was never a place of where people tried to go, or which would be something to reach towards. And in that sense, it's incredibly different. Now, if the Americans want to live out in the country, it has to do with their history. That it has to do with the way the country was conquered, the way the country was colonized, and so on. The city never reached a place of privilege, which had, in a way, to do. I mean, one has here to distinguish that lately Marx's writings on the origin of the city have been published, and the basic discussion is really that the European city is basically a military fortress. And out of that military organization of defense, a new quality arose, which was urbanity. And that never happened in America, whatever one tends to say, that the Indians were bad and so on. In fact, it was very peaceful countryside. Otherwise, the Americans would have cities by now. Now, at this moment where we know that in a capitalist economy, the city is not necessary, it becomes a political choice. And in that sense, I come now back to Marx's, or rather Engels's, statement that a communist society would firstly tend towards solving this problem of town and countries, this inequality. I think the only one has to solve it in a form, in a way, not just by destroying the city or the country. And there one has really to see that the country or the city, when you destroy the city, in the same time you destroy the country, which is very strange. Which is a strange dialectical thing, which is difficult to understand. And I think that one only can really resolve this problem of country and town by building cities. It is only a problem how this city is built, and that everybody becomes part of this place, which after all is privileged. Why could you not have cities which are small enough to have agriculture in between, that the peasants make part of an urban reality? It's completely possible. There are models for that. And now, I think really the main thing which I want to put in, that by destroying the city, you in the same time destroy the countryside.
Do you have anything to say to that?
I don't see why the destruction of the city means that you destroy the countryside.
Well, that's a historical fact. That's a historical fact.
But surely the point which is in some ways in dispute here, first come out, what is the status of the suburb then? Yeah.
I mean, it's all very well to make points which you've made, which actually justify your argument, but they don't go beyond it. They're entirely internally coherent, but they don't actually extend it. They're just a rephrasing of it, and they're not actually reasons why you would take the city as your typological base.
It's an,
I think that my interpretation of the reasons would be that in order to have your concept of alienation and in order to have your concept of types, you actually have to take the city.
No, you miss something out. I mean, if you choose the city, it's for very strong reasons. Because the city is the only way where a public realm is expressed, or where it is possible to express problem. You can't go into the countryside and express, public realm. The suburb is by definition a reduction of the city. It's a suburb, sub.
Is that
it
the
is.
only thing which can be expressed by an architecture in the city?
It is a parasitic form.
I mean, is that the only substance of the language, of your language?
To understand the thing with substance.
Is that the only thing which should work? Is that the only, is it the expression of the public realm which in fact generates typology?
Well, the public realm, the public realm makes part of a typological construct. And that is what is really different with the, everything evolves in types. Even the modern movement has evolved types. The office building, the petrol station, everything is types. You can't avoid it. What is important is the relationship of type, of building and public realm, of the built and the unbuilt. And that they are dialectical, and not just that you take buildings and you put them, you link them by cars. It's that really what is built and what is in between buildings is as important in a way, or more important than the building itself. In the first argument, then you go on.
Maurice, would you like to respond to David's question?
I agree with Leo Krier. What I could say is that we work, by example, in Brussels, in the city, for two reasons. One is tactical, and I must agree with you, we work in the city because it is in the city that we could have our own tactical, use the media, the press, by example, and so on, because they focus in the center of the city. This is clear. If we were working in a small suburb, probably we will have quite more difficulties to express our idea in the city. But the second fact and more important is that it is in the city that let's say we find the people that are the less privileged people. It is in the city, it's not in this kind of countryside. They are in the suburb around the city, but not in the countryside. And when we are fighting for a city, it's clear that we are fighting also for the country. If you fight for a city that is not a zoning, you fight against also expressways that are going through all the country and so on. So the fight is linked. And the reality is that today, in Brussels, group in the center of the city of Brussels are dealing with a group of people that are agriculture. We have the same fight against highway, by example, and we work together. So we have done the links, but we start by the center of the city because we are very few people, it's quite clear.
No, but also there is the basic problem that in a way today you don't need that many people for agriculture. That's a field which can be rationalized incredibly well. And you see when you fly over America, you see these fantastic grids, and you understand why the American agriculture is so superior. So in a way 95% of people can live in cities. They don't need to live in the countryside.
Well, let's ask Robert Stone.
Why don't they want to? There's an ideological problem.
Come in, Robert.
First of all, I would like to say a couple of things. One, I more or less agree with Peter Cook, particularly with your footnote to Peter Cook's criticism. I do feel that there's a sort of terrible pessimism in this room, which I, for one, don't enjoy hearing nor share. The other thing is, with regard to this discussion of cities, I have this terrible feeling, Leo, that when you say city, you have a very, it's not terrible from your point of view, but I think people shouldn't confuse it, a very specific idea of what a city ought to be and what a city is. Certainly what you're talking about as a city is not an American city.
No,
At all.
absolutely not.
It isn't an English city either, in my opinion. The English have
Used to be.
historically always regarded the city as horrible, and they have
That's
said
not
that
true. That's not true.
the aristocracy of the English 18th century came to town to do its business and get the hell out. That was its entire role of the city. The city was. We have in London a city that is far more like an American city, far more like a Houston, if you will, than it is like Paris or Brussels, where I have not been, but I have been to Paris enough or Rome. It's spread out. It's a collection of really country in city and not dense center. We are in the only dense center of all, or one of the few, of London. I spent the afternoon on the Heath in London. And it's like, okay. So I think that you have a very specific view, and I think all architects should have specific views to help organize themselves, although I have to say that we have now had 50 or 60 years in which architects have told us what the city is, and they have managed to make one mistake after another, and in the process destroy all cities of various kinds to make one no city.
Now, but what we pretend is to know that what the city was.